work on getting started then. So as we have people come in, if you need a paper, you still need one? Okay. I asked and I saw one of these numbers, so I wasn't sure. All right. Sorry.
Did you have a good vacation?
I did. Yeah, it was good. All right. Well, I figure I'm only allowed so many substitutes, so I got to come back at some point. No, we had Chris come on week 2, and he did a good job, and he was doing that in accord with his schooling and everything, and wrote his lesson, did a great job. And then I wrote the lesson last week, and Braden taught it for me. And so if the lesson was bad, you still get to blame me, even though Braden taught it for me. But we're back to normalcy. As I'm walking through, I thought what would be helpful for people in an Old Testament survey would be just kind of to give you the stories as they come up, semi-chronologically. And as I was doing that, because I can't give you every book individually, because, 10 weeks and 39 books just doesn't math, what I thought about doing was potentially just, combining important aspects of each book so you get the overall message. And then what I realized this morning is I am never going to find time then to get you the book of Job, because it would have happened in the middle of Genesis. So just as a quick aside, this has nothing to do with today's lesson, but the book of Job is a poetry book, and it would have likely happened around the time of Abraham. And so it's kind of a weird place to stop. We'd almost have to stop in the middle of our Genesis talk about Job, and then come back later. And so Job would have been a very beneficial book for the early writers, just because they would have got to hear how do we make sense of suffering. And they would have gone through a good bit of suffering getting to where they're going. And so this would have been an important thing for these early people. But nonetheless, just throwing that out there. So we will not have a lot of information about the book of Job. So I'm very sorry if you were looking for that and waiting for it. You will be sorely disappointed. But we'll kind of go on from there. I was just thinking about it this morning. I was telling Chris and somebody else about it, and I'm like, we're not going to end up hitting Job then, because I should have already done that in week 2. But it's too late now. There's your 2-minute excerpt on Job. Yeah. If it helps you at all for next week, we will be going over next week Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. So everyone's like, oh, great. 59 chapters. Yeah. Well, like I said, unfortunately, when there's 39 books, you're going to summarize a couple things here and there. Just 1 or 2. So we are still actually in the Sinai period. I entitled today's lesson From Kadesh to Canaan. Where Braden finished the lesson at last time is the Israelites had just come to Kadesh Barnea. They've just come to where they need to be to potentially go into the land of Canaan, and they determine they don't want to go. Like I said, we focused last week on the Exodus. We got 13 months in the wilderness. They get up to there, and they decide, that's hard. We don't want to do that. And as we walk through Numbers, which the Hebrew for that is Bamidbar, It means in the wilderness, which if you take a look at what's happening in Numbers, it's literally their time in the wilderness from Sinai till they go into the promised land. They are looking, and that you're seeing what's going on with the Israelites during this time. This is a good book where you see the outworking of what they've heard in the previous book. So in Exodus, they're getting the law. You see as quickly as they're getting it, they're breaking it. And then when you get into Numbers, you see the practical day-to-day, how did this work out? And the answer is generally not good. Not good. It didn't go well. They did not show good faith towards God in a lot of cases. The most notable form of this was deciding not to go into the promised land. So God had already got the people out of Egypt. Unfortunately, Egypt was still in the people. And so that is the problem he is dealing with. This major lapse in faith in God cost these adult Israelites the opportunity to go into the promised land at all. God tells them they will not get to go in now. And so today we're going to look at the rest of the wilderness wanderings and Moses' reinstitution of the covenant and his encouragement to the younger generation to actually trust God. The first point we're going to look at today I've entitled Failing to Enter into God's Rest. Failing to enter into God's rest. So God responds to their faithlessness. Like I said, they just went up. They said, we're not going. This is what God says in response. Oh, by the way, they're so mad at Moses that they're like, we could kill you. And, Joshua and Caleb, because you brought us up here, and this is way harder than it was supposed to be. God, why would you make things hard? And so they're ready to kill Moses, and God pops in and, is like, I will smite them. And then he's like, well, no, God, okay, please don't do that. And then God answers this way in Numbers 14, verse 11.
And the Lord said unto Moses, how long will this people provoke me? And how long will it be ere they believe me, for all the signs which I have shown among them?
So it's interesting. God's concern for the people of Israel isn't like, oh no, they made a single mistake here. It's why don't they believe me? Why don't they trust me? Why can't they see that I am faithful? I've shown them all these things, but they still don't get it. And I guess we could get there when we get to Deuteronomy, but Deuteronomy talks about how God purposefully sent them through some difficulties so that they would be able to trust God or be able to see what was in them. And the answer was nothing good. It was not faith, that is for sure. Numbers 14, 22 and 23.
Because all those men which have seen my glory and my miracles, which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, have tempted me now these 10 times, and have not hearkened to my voice. Surely they shall not see the land which I swore unto their fathers, neither shall any of them that provoked me see it.
Yeah, so he says, look, I've shown them, they've seen my glory, they've seen my miracles, they saw what I did in Egypt. And I mean, think about that. We talked about this a little bit last week, but you literally just watched God perform 10 plagues showing he bested the gods of this other nation, that he has power over every natural thing that could cause you any difficulty. And then you get 3 days in the wilderness and you're like, can we go back to those people who hate us and enslaved us and tried to kill our children because we're thirsty? Because we're hungry, because we're not satisfied with the kind of food that you gave us, God. We really want flesh pots, and, right now you've just given us this weird bread. It's kind of sweet. I'm sick of it. And it doesn't really go very well. And notice here, God gives these people a greater condemnation, these adult Israelites, because they had clearly seen God's faithfulness and still refused to trust and obey him. Think about it even in the sense of the New Testament where Jesus says, Sodom and Gomorrah will come in judgment against you because we did greater miracles in these cities that he's in, and they would have repented. Or, the city of Nineveh will come up in judgment against you because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, but one greater than Jonah is here. Imagine how incredible it is. You've literally seen all these miracles, and you're like, nope, God can't take care of me. Can't happen. Now, before we press them too far, have you seen God be faithful? And then you go back and be like, oh no, I can't trust God for this. I'm in trouble. Yeah, we have too. And the problem with the Israelites isn't the Israelites, it's that they're human. And we fit right along with them. Now that said, the Israelites continue in their rebellion. They don't stop there. It's not like they heard that and they were like, oh no, let's fix it. As a matter of fact, the first thing they try to do, God says you don't get to go into the promised land. They, sleep it off, and then they say, I think we are going to go. We're going to go into the promised land. We were wrong yesterday. God forgive us. Let's go anyway. And God says, no. They try to tell Moses. Moses is like, I am not moving the ark. We're not coming. You're going to now go in. You were worried about them killing you and taking your wives and your children. What do you think they're going to do when God doesn't go with you? But because the Israelites only wanted to do whatever God said don't do, here is their next response. Numbers 14, 44, and 45.
But they presumed to go up into the hilltop. Nevertheless, the ark of the covenant of the Lord and Moses departed not out of the camp. Then the Amalekites came down.
Do we lose the mic? Should have a red light on if it's working. What?
Do you want me to read it again?
It's on. You're just not very loud. Speak like you're yelling at me.
But they presumed
There
to
you
go
go.
up into the hilltop. Nevertheless, the ark of the covenant of the Lord and Moses departed not out of the camp. Then the Amalekites came down, and the Canaanites which dwelt in that hill, and smote them, and discomfited them, even unto Hermah.
Okay, so they tried to go anyway. And so God said, I'm not going with you. Moses said, I'm not going with you. And they tried to go anyway. And eventually what happens is the enemy comes down and smites them. So now you have people who died because not only did you not listen the first time when God was going to do the battles for you, but now you didn't listen when he said, I'm not doing the battle for you. And so now you have people who died just because they're not listening. And we should maybe hit on that a little bit. Part of the reason people think God is mean in the Old Testament is sin causes death. And just about every time we talk about a sin that Israel commits, people die from it. It's not like this, no harm, no foul, and it doesn't matter, everything's fine. Like, sin is a big deal. And God is really trying to drive that point home after the law has been introduced. He's trying to show you sin is a big problem, and it will cause grave difficulty. And what you're supposed to see is, I can't follow the law. And unfortunately, that's not the ultimate understanding they come to. But nonetheless, we see that they tried to go up anyway, and it doesn't stop there. Then they get to the point where some of them aren't even keeping the basic things God said. They start missing things like keeping the Sabbath. God made it a very special rule for his people that they would keep the Sabbath, the seventh day holy. Based upon week 1, does anyone remember why we celebrate the Sabbath? Because God rested from creation, yeah. So it's a recognition of God as creator, as God is in charge, as God is our provider, our creator, or the one who's going to take care of us. And most of the time when he gets on to people for doing things on the Sabbath, a lot of the time it has to do with making money. A lot of them are trusting in their money and not trusting in God. And that's something you'll see a lot of the times when you get into people who are breaking the Sabbath. Now, not necessarily every time, but in a lot of cases, it goes back to that thing where Jesus said you can either serve God or mammon. But you get there, and here people again are breaking the Sabbath. So in the next chapter, after chapter 14, Moses reminds the people what rightful worship is supposed to look like, that they need to be separate from their neighbors and what they do, and separate from sin. And the Jews then were to have specific sacrifices and diets and daily practices and clothing and specified days of worship. And the intention was that the Jews would be set apart from the nations around them, that they would be ready to be in fellowship with the Lord. Now, some were already disrupting this balance while out in the wilderness. According to Numbers 15:32-41, they find a guy who's out and he's doing things on the Sabbath. And they take him, they kind of throw him in a temporary cell, basically, and say, Moses, what do we do with the guy? And Moses said, he's going to die. And we hear that and we're like, oh, that's really, really tough. But again, God is making an example out of the law. Even every time something new initiates, God makes examples out of things. Think about in the New Testament, the church starts, Ananias and Sapphira tell a lie about how much they sold something for, and they die. Like, it's not a small thing. So again, you got people who are breaking down their normal, how do we worship God? What do we do? And then not only that, they go further. They go as far as saying, we want to get rid of the leadership that we have. Moses, Aaron, Levites, we don't actually like the way you're doing things. This is where the story of the sons of Korah comes up. If you're familiar with the sons of Korah, or, well, technically it's Korah and the sons of Reuben and 250 princes that follow them, because technically the sons of Korah is a different group that you read about in the Psalms. But Korah has this idea that he ought to be able to kind of be in charge, to do sacrifices, to do what they want to do. And he was a Levite, so he already had some kind of work to do in the temple. It just wasn't the main work. It wasn't the doing of the sacrifice. And so they're going through and they're basically fighting with Moses and Aaron about this. And they bring up an idea. They said, okay, go take a censer, go get one of the incense holders, basically, and we will have God show which ones are the right ones. And they fight with Moses more, and it turns into this thing, and Moses says, you know what, God, don't accept their sacrifice. And they said, look, if these people die a normal death, then God didn't send me, I'm not your man. But if they die in a supernatural way, then you will see that they are sinning against God. And if you're familiar with the story of Korah, what happens is the earth opens up, swallows them, and closes. Immediately. God's like, hey, get away from them. And they go, and they're gone. I'm sure it made that sound too. Okay, maybe that part's not in the Bible. But it's one of those things. We see, again, like they're disobeying what God said. They're not worshiping the way they're supposed to. They're trying to get rid of God's leaders. Like, they're not making important steps forward right now. Now, granted, they were just told, you're going to be in the wilderness for 40 years. They've only been there 13 months as of that point. They're getting to where they're being here a little longer. And one of the things you don't always get to see in the book, and sometimes it takes some extra explaining, between chapter 19 and chapter 20 is a 38-year jump. It just moves towards the end of their time very quickly. And they find even this new generation has to learn how to trust God. They don't get it right away. And so it takes even some of the same things you've seen the older generation do, and I think God uses the same things on purpose. So like, here's an example. Numbers chapter 20 is where you get that jump to the newer generation, and the people find themselves groaning. They're groaning for a lack of water. Now, if you're familiar with the first group, God gave them water from what? A rock. He gave them water from a rock. And what God told Moses to do with the rock is he said, hit the rock and water will come out. And apparently enough water to feed about 2 million people. So this wasn't like just some small, like, and a little, like, fountain just shot forth. No, it was like spewing water out. So all these people and their animals, and because they have all those things, are able to drink. Like, this is an immense amount of water. And here, again, you've got this newer generation doing the same thing. God, there's no water. Let's grumble against Moses. Let's grumble against all these things. And God has the rock there, and he says, okay, Moses, this time don't hit the rock, but talk to it. Speak to the rock. So they see, again, God is glorified. And it's one of those things where God is glorified not just in what the action is, but in us doing what he says. Sometimes what God will impress upon people to do doesn't make any sense to us in the moment. I'm sure this is one of those scenarios where it's like, talk to a rock, or, walk into an ocean when there's an army of Egyptians behind me and just, tell the seas to split, like hold up the rod and watch it go. Like, that's not one of those mental things that you're like, yeah, this makes sense on the front end. I get this. But you see, Moses did not talk to the rock. Moses is getting so fed up with these people. He's been with them 39 years now. And he walks up to the rock and he smacks it with the staff. He says, do me and Aaron have to go fetch you water again? And he smacks it with the staff twice. Now God, knowing that, the people do still need the water, lets the water come out of the rock. But he takes this moment and he shows them and he says, look, Moses, because you did not glorify me in the way you were supposed to, you don't get to go into the promised land either. This is a heartbreaking moment because, you manage 40 years of dealing with people who are complaining and whining and trying to get you out and wanting to kill you, and you mess it up at the 5-yard line. I mean, I don't know if I'm mixing too many metaphors here, but like you just barely missed it. But again, you've got that same pattern where they go through something, they need to see that they can trust God. You see it again in chapter 21. In chapter 21, first off, we don't read the whole thing, but there are a couple battles that go on in chapter 21. It starts with a battle. It goes to this really odd section about them complaining about food, and then it goes to another battle. And so as we go there, it starts with a battle. They're successful in retrieving people who have been imprisoned and taken, and then they start complaining about God not giving them the food that they want. And they're like, all we have is this sweet bread and we're sick of it. It's almost like we've heard that before. Well, you did, because the first group said that too. And what happens then is God sends snakes to bite the people. And you guys have probably heard this story before. These are the fiery serpents. They're venomous snakes. And people start dying. And they're like, all right, Moses, please, can you get God to send the snakes away? And Moses goes to God, and he prays, and he says, okay, God, can we get rid of these snakes? And God's like, no, here's what we're going to do. You're going to keep the snakes, but you're going to basically form a brazen snake, put it on a pole, and hold it up into the air. It's going to, not him personally, but it's going to go up in the air in the center. And if someone gets bit, they can look at it and be healed. And here, we'll show you that. Numbers 21, verses 8 and 9.
And the Lord said to Moses, make thee a fiery serpent, and set it upon a pole, and it shall come to pass that every one that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, shall live. And Moses made a serpent of brass, and put it on a pole. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived.
Okay, so this is a weird 6-verse thing. If we just read this, we'd be like, what in the world is going on? What God is trying to do is God is going to use all these even seemingly small Old Testament stories, and he's going to turn them into a beautiful picture of what Christ is going to do for you. You see, the same way that we had something like poisonous within us that was killing us, we have sin. And just like a snake was lifted up, and if you look to it, in other words, if you hear and what God's promise was, look to it and live, and you do it, we have Jesus, and we have him who has been crucified on our behalf. He was lifted up, and we then can look to Jesus and live. And he uses this Old Testament picture in John chapter 3, around one of everybody's favorite verses in the entire Bible, John 3:16. Does anybody know it? Go ahead. For God so loved the world. Fantastic. The verses directly before this, he's quoting this story. When you go like verse 13, 14, he's quoting this story. He's telling them, just as the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And he's going to use every one of these seemingly insignificant Old Testament pictures, these Old Testament stories, and he's going to show you he's been working this out the whole time. He's giving them the concept of trust me at my word, because they don't have that yet. Now, they did. The ones that would look and live, they did live. But it doesn't stop there, because unfortunately the rebellion is a continual thing that people deal with. In Numbers 22 through 24, which we're just going to briefly talk over, you have the story of Balaam. You guys familiar with the story of Balaam? Balaam was a prophet for hire. And Balaam went through and he had a king whose name is Balak. It's always really easy when they have two similar names and they do different things. So you've got Balaam and Balak, and Balak calls Balaam, says, hey, come to me, come curse these Israelites. And first Balaam says, no, I can't, God won't let me. And then Balak sends a bigger party and says, hey, we'll give you all kinds of money, we'll give you all kinds of things, please come with us, please come curse these Israelites. And Balaam says, well, no, but I'll ask God. And so God eventually allows Balaam to go, and it turns into this big thing. And Balaam is going, potentially, to curse the people of Israel. And on the way, he ends up face to face with the angel of the Lord. Little does he know. His donkey had to tell him, in case you're not familiar with the story. And if you want to go watch somebody argue with a farm animal, open your Bibles to Numbers 22 through 24. Obviously, it's not through that whole section, but you might as well read the whole section if you're going to go. But what happens is Balaam realizes, oh, I didn't see what was going on. And the angel reiterates to him, don't say anything I don't tell you to say. And so he goes and he tries, they go do sacrifices, and they say, okay, curse these people for me. And Balaam's like, I can't do it. God won't let me. I'll pray to God, see what he'll do, but he won't let me. And he goes to do it, and instead he blesses the people. And Balak gets mad, and they come back later, and they do another set of sacrifices, and he's like, curse the people, and he's like, well, I won't say anything God doesn't tell me to say, but I'll go see what he says. And they bless the people again. And so he does it one more time, and this time he doesn't try to go to God and see what God says. And instead, God takes over Balaam's mouth and makes him say something. And he makes him say really interesting things. But it ends where Balaam cannot curse the people. Balak is mad because God will not allow this to happen. But on the other side of that, then you have something kind of weird start to happen. You get almost a really odd shift in chapter 25, which is where we get to next. Somebody read Numbers 25, verses 1 to 3.
And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab, and they called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods, and the people did eat and bowed down to their gods, and Israel joined himself unto Baal Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel.
Okay, so God would not allow Balaam to curse Israel. But what Balaam did, and you'll find this out later, I think in Numbers 31, is Balaam sent women to go entice the men of Israel so they would commit sin, and then God would basically deal with them based upon their sin, not based upon him cursing them. And so Balaam sent unbelieving women to the people, and the people basically spoiled themselves. And so you see this again. They get to the point where they're interacting with these women. They're, probably doing things they shouldn't be doing, and they're even serving these other gods in Baal Peor. And that's what's happening. You see these pictures of, again, they just keep going worse and worse and worse. And we know the sins were not just in the general people, but like we said, also in the leaders. The leadership was not excluded from this. Miriam actually dies at Kadesh. She's 130 years old. And Miriam sinned against God in Numbers 12. That was during your last week's section. But she basically questioned Moses and said, has not God also spoken by me and Aaron? Why are you in charge, basically? And, God popped down and said, basically, who do you think you are? And little did she come to realize the relationship that God has with Moses is not like the relationship he has with anyone else. A relationship where he talks to him face to face like a friend. It's a beautiful thing. And what ends up happening is she gets cursed with leprosy for a week, comes back into the camp, but now that we're here, like I said, 38, 39 years later, she dies at 130. She does not make it into the promised land. And then you've got Aaron and Moses sinning against God. Now, if you're paying attention to Aaron's rap sheet, it grows quite a bit. So you see all the way back in Exodus 32, Aaron, remember, he made a calf. He made a golden calf for the people to worship their gods. These are the gods that drove you out of Egypt. Oh, no. No, they're not. Aaron also was with Miriam while she was questioning Moses on why he got to be in charge. Seemingly, he was siding with her in that argument. But you didn't see what exactly happened to him there. Nothing necessarily popped out like it did with Miriam, as she was the main aggressor. And he's also there with Moses when Moses is sinning and smacking the rock. And so he's sitting there, and he also is going to die before going into the promised land. He doesn't get to make it. Only 2 people make it into the promised land of the original men that were going to go. That being Joshua and Caleb, because they showed they had faith in God. Now, I don't want to take this to say that Moses didn't have faith in God. Don't misunderstand it. Moses had a great faith in God, and we actually get to find out later some different things. But God is doing something very interesting in the way that this all comes to pass. So first, Aaron dies. We'll talk about that first. This actually happens in Numbers 20. Aaron is told to go climb a mountain with his son, and there he will die, and to his son will be transferred his priestly role. He actually has to take his dad's clothes and everything, and he dies in front of everybody. Again, it's this really weird picture. You're like, why did God make him go die in front of all the people? And the answer is, God wanted the Israelites to see that this Levitical priesthood is not what it needs to be. It's not functional enough. The priests die. They're not enough in and of themselves. And Hebrews makes really interesting comments about this. Hebrews 7:23 through 25.
And they truly were many priests, because they were not suffered to continue by reason of death. But this man, because he continueth ever, hath an unchangeable priesthood. Wherefore he is able also to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing he ever liveth to make intercession for them.
So this was meant to make the people realize this Levitical priesthood's not enough. And in the New Testament, we see because we needed a priest after a different order. We needed the priest after the order of Melchizedek. We needed Christ, who is our eternal priest, who can actually save from beginning to end. It's a beautiful thing. But needless to say, Aaron also does not make it into the promised land. And finally, you have Moses, who also dies outside the promised land at Mount Nebo. Because Moses sinned in Numbers 20, God says you don't get to go in. Now, Moses still gives the second giving of the law in Deuteronomy. He's still going to talk to all the people. He's still doing all these things. But at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses also dies. Now, I've told you, Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. But some people may be like, well, how did Moses write this if he died in this chapter? The idea is that Joshua, being the one who came up after him, likely wrote Moses died. There are simple little hints about things like that in the book. Things like, and it continued this way and to this day. That's the idea. But that being the case, Moses also dies in Deuteronomy 34, 4 and 5.
And the Lord said unto him, This is the land which I swear unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord.
Now, I think Moses' life and death show the devastation that one sin can stop someone from entering into God's rest. It was one thing that you can come out and say, Moses did this, and this is what God said, because of this, you don't get to go. We like to minimize sin in our own lives. But this is where the practical side of James 2:10 comes from. If a man, Basically, if a man is free from sin, but is guilty in one point, he's guilty of all. He's guilty of breaking God's law. He's guilty of sin. And that is enough. Now, Moses, I would argue, does go to heaven, and I think you can see that by the fact that he comes to Jesus in the Mount of Transfiguration. He would have gone to Sheol, if you were listening this morning, and he would have been in Abraham's bosom. But he did not get to physically go into the land. And by the way, even the land is a picture of going to heaven. And so you have the person who represents the law not being good enough to get there on his own. Think about that. Think about the New Testament argument with that. That people, if you just try to follow the law, you can't earn your way to heaven. And even Moses, being the arbiter of the law, the person who brought in the covenant with the law, was not good enough by the law to enter. Now, granted, like I said, we know Moses had faith. We know Moses would be in heaven because he sees Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. But he did not get to go through that physical aspect of entering into God's rest. So that hits a lot of what's important in the book of Numbers. There are a couple other things. There's some battles with people like Sihon and Og. They were the Amorites, and they were giants. Specifically, Og was a giant, maybe Sihon too. But what you find is God delivered those people into the Israelites' hand. And they had all kinds of cities that they then had access to and places they could stay on this side of Jordan. And then the end of Numbers talks about how some people wanted to stay over here, and we're going to break up the land over there this way, and this is who gets what. And so you've got, Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh that wants to stay over here, and the other people want to go. And so that God allows that, but that's what's going on through the rest of the book of Numbers. When you come into Deuteronomy, what's happening is God is covenanting with the younger generation. You saw him do this. He uses the same treaty model as he used in Exodus 20. He uses, again, this suzerain vassal Hittite treaty. And it has the same aspects to it. He has a preamble. He goes through and he has a historical prologue. This is what I've done. This is how I'm faithful. What's interesting about this historical prologue is, for the first group, he said, I got you out of Egypt. I took care of you with the waters of Mar. I took care of you with these things. I gave you quail. You know what I mean? It's kind of like I secured your exit. I showed you my power. But in this one, he talks to things that these people went through for the most part. Now, he brings it back to Abraham. He says, I promised Abraham this, and see it's being fulfilled. But then he starts talking about Kadesh Barnea. He doesn't go all the way back to Egypt. He doesn't talk to them about what happened when they were children. He talks to them about their experiences of God being faithful. And so as you walk through that idea, he kind of goes, for the most part, from Kadesh Barnea on. He shows his faithfulness over the years, but even with that Israel did not follow God correctly. It's incredible. God was still faithful even when man was not. And, thank God for that, because we haven't broken that cycle necessarily. Just throwing that out there. God still protected the people from outside forces and armies, like he did in Numbers 21, where we talk about where he went and defeated Sihon and Og. In Numbers 31, where they go in and they defeat Baal Peor and Balaam and those people that originally caused the people to sin in Numbers 25. The religious curses. He does not allow Israel to be cursed by these outside groups in chapters 22 through 24. And not only that, but he provided for their needs along the way. He made sure that they did have food and water and things that were necessary. If you get all the way to Deuteronomy 29, I think 29:5, he talks about how even their shoes never went out, if that makes sense. I don't know about you guys. I go through a pair of shoes about every 2 or 3 months. And it's because I use and abuse them. I probably use one pair of shoes for far too many things, but that's neither here nor there. But that's why I stopped buying expensive shoes. It's because even the expensive ones I like. Anyway. But because of that, you see, again, God's faithfulness to take care of these people. Then you have the covenant obligations in chapters 5 to 26. The covenant obligations begin with the 10 Commandments in chapter 5. He goes through and he relists those. And then as you walk through chapter 26, he's basically fleshing out what those look like in real life. He's basically fleshing out, this are the things you don't do if you don't want to fall into idolatry. Stop marrying these foreign women. Stop doing these things. Don't sacrifice your children to idols. Please, please stop doing this. And he's going through and he tells them all these things, and he's showing them, this is how you would live this out. And they, don't do it very well. If you walk through these chapters, you'll find idolatry is mentioned again and again and again and again. What I think we need to see from the Mosaic Law is the Mosaic Law understood we couldn't be perfect because it has built-in sacrifice system. The Mosaic Law understood we couldn't do everything right. So what God was trying to gain by the Mosaic Law was not perfection, but our allegiance. It was supposed to be our allegiance. And so we see that. He's saying, don't go to idolatry. Stop going to these other gods. Trust me. And he teases out the right way to do that with him and with one's neighbor. And interestingly enough, he even foretells several times future events or things that would happen. Like in Deuteronomy 17, he talks about things that a king should or should not do. So kings need to stay away from, many horses, many wives, a lot of money. That's what he said. If you're the king, you need to be weary of those things. Well, why? Well, horses, you start trusting in your might, not God. If you have a lot of money, you start trusting in your finance and not God. If you have a lot of women, they start to turn your heart away from God. Ask Solomon. We'll get there. Anyway, you see this picture. And one of the coolest things, I read the Bible a bunch of times before I saw this. Well, a few times before I saw this, and I think it's so cool. Did you know the king was supposed to write out his own handwritten copy of God's word? And he was supposed to study it every day. Imagine if we had a king who did that. How incredible would that be? Anyway, I got to keep going. I'm running out of time. It also talked about a prophet coming like unto Moses. That would be one that saw God face to face and would present God's words. In case you're not familiar with who that is Jesus. Think about the opening even in John 1. In Arche and Hologos, he's saying, in the beginning, as far back as you can go, was the Word. And the Word was with God. That literally means was face to face with God. Pros ton theon, right in front of God's face. He was toward God. And again, when Jesus is on earth, what does he say? I always do what the Father tells me. I always say, everything I've said is what God told me to say. This is that prophet like unto Moses that they were supposed to listen to and don't. And of course, the future captivity is also spelled out in the blessings and the cursings, which is something we'll see here in a minute. You've got the deposition and the public reading would be seen in 27, 2, and 3. You have the witnesses. He says, I'm just going to read this because we're out of time. Give ear, O ye heavens, and I will speak, and hear, O earth, the words of my mouth. That doesn't literally mean he's asking the rocks to tell you, yes, God said this, but the people in the heavens, the angels, the angelic beings, the earth, the people. And he gives blessing and cursings in 28. Now, if you're ever familiar with this, he gives 14 verses of blessings, and he goes from 15 to 68 on cursings. If you mess this up, it will be bad. If you take the time to read the chapter, you'll find that God often refers to his punishments of the Israelites for their disobedience. Everything he says there, he plays out. He says, hey, you're going to get sold to another group of people, and nobody's even going to want to buy you. You're going to, I'm just saying, you're going to, go through these incredible difficulties. I'm going to take away rain from you. I'm going to have locusts come and eat all your food. I'm going to have, and he starts listing things. And as you walk through the prophets, you'll see, hey, God does that. God does it again. He did that too. He pretty much did everything he said he was going to do in Deuteronomy 28. And God warns Moses, because the people have to accept this. They say, yes, we're going to do everything you say. And Deuteronomy 31, and the Lord said unto Moses, behold, thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, you're going to die, and this people will rise up and go a-whoring after the gods of the strangers of the land. They will fail. It's going to happen. They don't even get into the land before God tells them they're going to fail. They will forsake me, break the covenant which I've made for them, and my anger will be kindled against them in that day. I will forsake them, and I will hide my face for them. They shall be devoured, and many evils and troubles shall befall them, so that they shall say in that day, are not these evils come upon us, because our God is not among us? You see, what God wanted from the people is not what they thought. God wanted their love and allegiance. Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, there's the allegiance, and thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And if you loved God, you would follow his law. Think about that. The whole law hangs on two things, love God, love people. Just shows when we don't do those things, we don't love God the way we're supposed to. We don't love people the way we're supposed to. All right, and I've got to be done. I'm going to read my conclusion. I put important theophanies types on the back. There's beautiful things. There's the rock in the wilderness, the manna, the bronze serpent, which we talked about. Balaam, when God takes over his mouth, he makes a profession about there being a ruler that comes out of Judah. Numbers 35, we have the death of the high priest and that atoning for sin somehow. And that's a picture of our great high priest who would die and atone for sin. We've got the prophet like unto Moses. We have Moses as the initiator of the covenant. Aaron is the faithful high priest. Anyway, as Christians, we have the benefit of hindsight. We see all the craziness that the Israelites went through, and we like to believe we would have been different. But remember, only 2 spies trusted God. We would like to believe that would have been us, but in reality, it probably wouldn't have been. None of the leadership remained sinless, and as we look back, we can't just judge their sin, but we need to see us in their sin. We need to see our own mistakes with them. As much as these people were faithless and sinful, so often we are too. Just like them, we need Jesus. We need a Savior. They don't yet get the full picture, but God is faithfully carrying out his plan. God has promised that the way of salvation is coming. He created a nation out of one man's family. He redeemed them from slavery. He's brought them to the edge of the promised land, and we see that God is not done with them yet. God will accomplish his plan, and to God be the glory. All right, that said, that is our time. We've got to be done. They are staring at me in the windows. So, I'm just going to pray real fast, and we'll be done. Dear God, thank you for your word. Thank you what we can glean from it. God, help us to love you, to learn from you, and to realize that unless we had Christ, so go we.